Welcome to the hidden corners where truth and terror collide. Discover a realm where the lines between the living and the supernatural blur as you embark on a journey to the paranormal and visit the mysterious hidden corners of your mind. The Lighthouse Ghosts by Ginger Winters. As a young girl, I was fascinated by lighthouses. They seemed so romantic, and I loved the solitude of them. I remember reading a story about a young girl, about my age at the time, who lived at a lighthouse with her father. Once a month he would take his rowboat and paddle ashore to get supplies. He would leave his young daughter to keep an eye on the place while he was gone. He would leave early, before she was awake, and be home by supper time to light the big lanterns. But one day an unexpected squall arose, and the waves overturned the boat. The little girl waited for her father, who never arrived. She knew he was out there in that storm, and had to somehow light the big lanterns to bring him home. It was nearly an impossible feat, but she struggled and managed to do it. Utterly exhausted and scared for her father, she cried herself to sleep in the big tower. As the storm lifted, her father was able to rescue his boat and made it back to the lighthouse shore just at the first light of dawn. He found his little girl crumpled on the floor of the tower, fast asleep, and carried her to her little bed in the house. Beside her on the pillow, he laid the only thing he'd been able to save from his load of supplies that he'd lost when his boat overturned, a chocolate bar. I've never forgotten that story and how as simple a thing as a chocolate bar symbolized so much love. It's not a ghost story, but a sweet story nonetheless. But it seems that almost every lighthouse bears the weight of some tragic tale. The isolation, harsh conditions, and constant work were too much for many of the people charged with keeping those lights glowing through listless nights and unrelenting storms. One of the most famous ghost stories about a lighthouse is the legend of Seguin Lighthouse, which reads more like the script of a horror film. In the mid-1800s, the lighthouse's new keeper and his wife moved onto the island. To entertain them during the long, lonely nights, the keeper arranged for a piano to be brought to the lighthouse for his wife to play. However, she only knew how to play one song, so she played it over and over and over. The aggravation of hearing that same song played repeatedly caused the lighthouse keeper to go mad. He finally broke down one night and took an axe to the piano, then to his wife, and finally himself. Many visitors to the lighthouse claim they have heard the ghostly melody of a piano playing. One tragic story that always fascinated me is about the South Manitou Island Lighthouse on a small, sleepy island about 45 miles northwest of Traverse City, Michigan. Between 1866 and 1878, Aaron and Julia Sheridan operated the lighthouse. Over the course of the 12 years there, they had 6 sons. On March 15, 1878, Aaron, Julia, and their youngest son, Robert, was returning from a trip to the mainland when the sea capsized their boat. They were drowned. The bodies of the family never washed ashore, but their ghosts, according to legend, still haunt the remote lighthouse. The historic Boston Light overlooks the sea from Little Brewster Island, casting a light beam 27 miles into the Atlantic. This island is home to the oldest continually used and last staffed lighthouse in the country, which dates back to the Revolutionary War. Prior to housing Boston Light, the island was used for sending signal fires to aid novice travelers navigating the dangerous sandbars and unpredictable weather. Boston Light was first lit on September 14, 1716, and was operated by its first keeper, George Worthylake, who also acted as pilot for vessels entering the harbor. Unfortunately, George, his wife and daughter, and 2 men drowned in 1718 after their boat capsized returning to the lighthouse. Benjamin Franklin went on to write a ballad about the event, entitled Lighthouse Tragedy. The lighthouse on Little Brewster Island still looks out over the blue waters of the Atlantic, its white tower motionless through the day, like a seagull sleeping on the rock, its gray-yellow eye wide open and winking steadily once a minute all through the night. And the birds visit the island. In the summer of 1947, Maisie Anderson and her family lived on the little island where sits America's first lighthouse. That summer, she met the ghost of the Boston Light. One day, while walking along the rocky beach, Maisie thought she heard footsteps behind her. She turned, thinking it was one of her children, but no one was there. She shrugged it off, thinking it was just the shifting of rocks along the shore. Later that evening, she was awoken by the feeling of a presence in her room, but upon turning on the light, again, there was no one there. This continued for several nights, and then she began hearing what sounded like laughter in the distance, coming from the boathouse. Her husband reassured her it was only one of the shorebirds, possibly a loon, and she quickly dismissed it. Summer turned to fall and brought late September storms with the wind and the rain beating against the seaward windows. Maisie and her family were sitting around the dinner table when suddenly there was a quick blow on the window, as if someone had thrown a ball of wet seaweed or sand against it. "It's only a bird," said Maisie, to hush her children's fears. It was a common enough occurrence. The light would draw them in, and then it blinds them. Most times they would fly against the big lantern above, but now and then one would fly into the window. Sometimes after a big storm, they would find 100 dead birds around the tower. One day in early November, Maisie's husband fell ill with a fever and went to bed shortly after noon. Fog filled the harbor in the early evening, and Maisie went to wake her husband to ask him about starting the foghorn engine. As she reached her bedroom, she heard the engine start up, and the foghorn called out into the harbor. Her husband was still in bed. Who had started the engines? Maisie didn't have time to think about what had just happened, as night was quickly approaching and the beacon had to be lit. She started to head towards the tower, but suddenly the massive light came on and illuminated a figure against the lens. Someone had already turned on the light. Upon entering the tower, Maisie found no one was there. In the weeks that followed, Maisie began to hear sobbing and would sometimes hear a girl's voice calling what sounded like, "Shadwell, Shadwell," near the mooring. After a long winter of listening to the cries of the foghorn and the distraught girl's voice in the night, spring came, and Maisie and her family left Little Brewster Island for another post. It wasn't until years later that Maisie read about Boston Light's first keeper, George Worthylake. One day in November, Worthylake, his wife, and their daughter were visiting a friend who had anchored nearby the island. A man who helped them at the lighthouse stayed behind. When it was time for Worthylake, his wife, and daughter to return, the man paddled out to the mooring in a canoe to bring them ashore. Tragically, before he could reach them, the boat they were on capsized, and they were all thrown overboard. The cries of the girl were the last to be heard as they were taken by the sea. No one survived, despite the man's attempts to reach them in his canoe. Records show his name was Shadwell. This story brings to mind another lighthouse ghost story I remember hearing. It's called Messengers at the Window and was originally written by Henry Van Dyke. It goes something like this. Marcel Thibault was an honest man, strong in the heart, strong in the arms, but in his conscience, well, he had his weaknesses. His father, the old Thibault, lived in the days when there was no lighthouses there, and shipwrecks were the chief trade of the coast. It is a cruel trade to live by the misfortune of others, but Thibault was born under that influence, and all the time he was a boy, he heard people talking of what the sea might bring to them, clothes and furniture and all kinds of precious things, and never a thought of what the sea might take away from the people who were shipwrecked and drowned. But Marcel's wife, Nataline, was a good woman with a good soul, and nothing could make her happy that came from the misery of another person. Her idea of goodness was like the light in the lantern of the lighthouse, something faithful and steady that warns people away from shipwreck and danger. Well, it happened one day that Marcel had to go to the village on a matter of business. He was coming back in his boat at late evening with his sail up and perfectly easy in his mind, though it was after sunset, because he knew that Nataline was entirely capable of kindling the light and taking care of it in his absence. The wind was moderate and the sea gentle. He had passed Caribou Point about 2 miles when suddenly he felt his boat strike against something in the shadows. He knew it couldn't be a rock. There was no hardness, no grating sound. He supposed it might be a tree floating in the water. But when he looked over the side of the boat, he saw it was a body of a dead man. The face was bloated and blue, as if the man had been drowned for some days. The clothing was fine, showing that he must have been a person of some wealth, but it was disarranged and torn, as if he had passed through a struggle to his death. The hands, puffed and shapeless, floated on the water, as if to balance the body. They seemed almost to move in an effort to keep the body afloat, and on the little finger of the left hand there was a great ring of gold with a red stone set in it, like a live coal of fire. When Marcel saw this ring, a passion of desire leaped upon him. "It is a thing of value," he said, "and the sea has brought it to me for my unborn child. What good is a ring to a dead man? But for my baby, it will be a fortune." So he reached out with his oar and pulled the body near to him and took the cold, stiff hand into his own. He tugged at the ring, but it would not come off. The finger was swollen and hard, and no effort that he could make served to dislodge the ring. Marcel grew angry because the dead man seemed to be withholding from him the bounty of the sea. He laid the hand across the gunwale of the boat, and taking up the axe that lay beside him, with a single blow he chopped the finger from the hand. The body of the dead man swung away from the boat, turning on its side, lifting its crippled left hand into the air, and sank beneath the water. Marcel laid the finger with the ring upon it in his boat and sailed on, wishing that the boat would go faster. But the wind was light, and before he came to the island it was already dark, and a white creeping fog, very thin and full of moonlight, was spread over the sea like a shroud. As he went up the path to the house, he was trying to pull the ring off the swollen finger. At last it came loose in his hand, and the red stone was as bright as a big star on the edge of the sky, and the gold was heavy in his palm. So he hid the ring in his vest and dropped the finger in a cluster of blueberry bushes not far from the path to the house. Nataline could tell right away that something was up. As she brought Marcel his supper, she casually asked, "Well, how did it happen?" "What happened?" said Marcel, a little surprised and caught off guard, and put his head down over his cup of tea to hide his face. "Well," she said in her joking way, "that is just what you haven't told me, so how can I tell you? But I know it was something very bad, or very good. Now, which was it? It was good, he said, reaching out his hand to cut a slice of bread. It was as good as bread. Said his wife. Was it by land or was it by sea? It was by sea, he said, smiling, a true treasure of the deep. Just then there came a sharp thud against the window. Marcel saw a hand with a little finger cut off, spread out against the pane. "My God!" he cried. "What was that?" "It's only a bird," she said. "What are you afraid of? It's probably stunned. I will go out and get it." She came back with a little cedar bird in her hand. Her face was very grave. "Look," she cried, "it is a récollet. He is only stunned a little. Look, he flutters his wings. He'll be okay. But he was sent to this house because there is something here to be confessed. What is it?" Marcel was visibly disturbed, and his conscience was getting the better of him, so he pulled the ring out of his vest and laid it on the table under the lamp. The gold glittered, and the stones sparkled, and he saw that her eyes grew large as she looked at it. "See," he said, "this is the good fortune that the waves brought me on the way home from the village. It is for our baby that is coming." "The waves?" she cried suspiciously. "How could the waves bring a heavy thing like that? It would sink." "It was floating," he answered, casting about in his mind for a good lie. "It was floating about 2 miles this side of Caribou Point. It was floating on a piece of—" At that moment there was another blow on the window, and something pounded and scratched against the glass. Both of them were looking this time, and again Marcel saw the hand without the little finger. But his wife could only see a blur and a movement. He was terrified and fell on his knees praying. She trembled a little, but stood over him brave and stern. "What is it that you have seen?" said Natalie. "Tell me, what has made you so afraid?" "A hand," he answered. "A hand on the window." "A hand?" she cried. "Then there must be someone waiting outside. Go and let him in." "No," he whispered, "you don't understand. I dare not." Natalie looked at him hard and waited a minute. She opened the door, peered out, trembled again, crossed the threshold, and returned with the body of a blackbird. "Look," she cried, "another messenger. His heart is beating a little. I will put him here where it is warm. Perhaps he will get well again. But there is a curse coming upon this house. Confess. What is this about hands?" Marcel was terrified to tell her his secret. "On the rocks this side of the point," he stammered, "as I was sailing very slowly, there was something white, the arm and hand of a man. This ring was on one of the fingers. Where was the man? Drowned and lost. What did he want of the ring? It was easy to pull it." As he said this, there was another crash at the window. The broken pane tinkled upon the floor. In the opening they both saw, for a moment, a hand with the little finger cut off and the blood dripping from it. When it faded, Natalie went to the window, and there on the floor, in a little red pool, she found the body of a dead crossbill, all torn and wounded by the glass through which it had crashed. She took it up and fondled it. Then she gave a great sigh and went to Marcel and kneeled beside him, putting one hand over his shoulder, the dead crossbill in the other. "Marcel," she said, "you have brought a curse down upon our house, and very soon our little baby is to be born. Tell me now what you've done, and I want the truth." At this, Marcel told her all of the shameful thing he had done. She stood up and took the ring from the table with the ends of her fingers as if she did not like to touch it. "Where is the finger of the hand from which this ring was stolen?" "I threw it in the bushes," he answered. "Find it," she said, "and get the boat." Marcel did as she commanded. The sea was very quiet and the moon was full. They rowed together until they came about 2 miles from Caribou Point, at a place where Marcel remembered because there was a broken cliff on the shore. When he dropped the finger, with the great ring glittering upon it, over the edge of the boat, he groaned. But the water received the jewel in silence, with smooth ripples, and a circle of light spread away from it under the moon. Natalie smiled. "Now," she said, "we have done what the messengers at the window told us. We have given back what the poor man wanted. But now, row me home, for I think my time is coming." The next day, just before sunrise, a baby was born. Natalie knew that it was born to good fortune. Today, all lighthouses in the United States are automated, with the exception of the Boston Light. A law was passed in 1989 requiring that the Boston Light remain manned, so a keeper remains there today. And what about the romance and solitude of lighthouses? The Three Dragar Lighthouse is the most isolated lighthouse in the world, off the coast of Iceland, and is only reachable by helicopter. Well, I think that's just a little too isolated for me.